Nick Pope, you worked for the British government's Ministry of Defense for 21 years. During that time, you spent 3 years in a special unit that was in charge of investigating thousands of UFO cases. You authored many books and have advised on various film and TV shows. You are a regular contributor to the popular show Ancient Aliens. Thank you so much for joining today. This is fantastic.
Thanks. It's good to be on the show.
You know what? So why don't we fill in the listeners? What is the Ministry of Defense compared to our government agencies here in the U.S.?
The Ministry of Defense in the UK is essentially the equivalent of the US Department of Defense. So it serves both as a policy-making Department of State, but also as the UK's highest level military headquarters. It's a mix of civilians and military, headed by our equivalent of SecDef. And I was a civilian employee there, as you said in the intro, for 21 years.
And just so that we know, your actual role there, what could that be like equated to in what we have here in the U.S.? Like, is it like ATIP or Arrow, one of these agencies that like Dave Grush worked for?
There are similarities and there are differences. The nearest similarity, actually, with the US program is the old, long since cancelled Project Blue Book, which was the US Air Force program looking at this. And the reason I say that that's the closest match is we were a public-facing program. So we took most of our reports from members of the public. I mean, obviously we did get reports, and those were particularly interesting, from military pilots, radar operators, and such like. But most of what we got came from the public, like Project Blue Book. So that's not to say that there aren't some similarities between the work that we did and, say, more modern US programs like ATIP, like the UAP Task Force, and like Arrow now. And we did do some classified work, but those programs that I mentioned, I mean, particularly things like ATIP, were very much behind closed doors. And until the New York Times reported the existence of ATIP, these, of course, weren't known to the public, whereas we were.
I'm curious, what was, because to Americans, obviously we don't trust our three-letter agencies. We always think they're up to some sort of subterfuge. So, what was the view of like an FBI, CIA, NSA from the perspective of the Ministry of Defense? Did it have that reputation on your side as well?
Yes, very much so. And we got a lot of correspondence. We got a lot of people contacting us or writing, talking about us in relation to the UFO issue, saying that we were, responsible for a cover-up. There was a big conspiracy. I was part of it, etc., etc. Those rumors. I mean, look, I did this job back in the 90s, but there are still people out there in the UFO community and in the conspiracy theory community who think I'm still secretly working for them, that my role is disinformation or whatever they think. So you're never going to escape that. Look, I mean, to a number of people, if you do this for the government, you are the bad guy. You're the villain, period.
Right. So I mean, so we have the people that did do the disinformation campaigns out here. I mean, that's very public knowledge that there were several of them. So did you have anything to the equivalent of that, though? I mean, I know you weren't part of it, but did they have anything like that there, or was that not a thing?
No, we did have something similar, and to be fair, I did play my part in this. I mean, simply put, we downplayed the true extent of our interest and involvement in this, and we used to deploy sort of standard sound bites to the media like, this is of no defense significance, or very limited defense interest. And we would deliberately, through the Defense Press Office, so we'd have our public affairs folks use kind of archaic and slightly disparaging terms like flying saucers and little green men. And, that's, you can have a debate about whether that's a psyop or whether that's a disinformation. I mean, it's elements of that, I suppose.
And okay, so since you did have that, when you look at what's going on right now, do you see little tiny sprinkles of disinformation happening? Because I was able to talk to Congressman Eric Burleson, and I asked his opinion. What do you think if this is disinformation? He couldn't give me a good, clear answer, right? So do you see, from your experience in doing this for government, that there are little sprinkles of, hey, watch out, this could be disinformation?
Absolutely, yes. And sometimes, I don't know. Well, let me kind of dial that back a little bit. I don't know whether disinformation, as opposed to, for example, what I might call an attempt to control the narrative. Now, you can have a debate about where the line is there, but I mean, a good example of that is the way in which, for example, a number of the people who formerly served in leadership positions in the Pentagon's Arrow unit that now have responsibility for this. Almost every time there's a congressional hearing on this subject, a couple of the people who were involved in senior leadership positions in Arrow, but no longer work there, kind of come out and go on the media circuit. And then DoD Public Affairs very carefully say, well, look, this isn't an official view. These people are expressing now, their private opinion because they no longer work for us. But it does look very planned, shall we say. There was another example of that very shortly after the House Oversight Committee hearing in, I think it was June of 2023, when David Grush first went public. If you remember, there was a journalist who then published a story detailing a number of run-ins or encounters that David Grush had with local law enforcement, and this was because a family member had called concerned about his state of mind, and it turned out, of course, this was PTSD related, tied in with the fact that he'd been to Afghanistan. But the point was that sources in the intelligence community, in having a conversation with this journalist, they didn't leak information, but they suggested to this journalist that if he cared to maybe look into any encounters he might have had with law enforcement, and then this led him to make Freedom of Information Act requests that then turned this up. So it was kind of what you might call a bit of spin, bit of dirty tricks. But again, I don't know if it counts as disinformation as such, but like I say, the phrase that I use is an attempt to seize narrative control and to play down certain people, certain storylines, certain aspects of all this, and try and still, I don't know, frame this as something kind of slightly crazy sci-fi conspiracy theory, whereas in fact, as people now recognize, this is a serious defense and national security issue.
But when you look at, let's say, Dave Grush, for example, and, they obviously did a background on him beforehand, and that, it was convenient that they chose somebody that might have some things in their background with the PTSD that they can then go and you blame as an out. So they can send someone to go, yeah, we're going to do an investigation here, but hey, we're going to use this particular person that we can dig through his file and say, hey, you really can't trust what he said because of his his record. Do you think that's a little too convenient, and he may actually be just being a tool in this, like he doesn't even know that he's being used?
I don't actually think so, because I think I don't know exactly how when he was director of the UAP task force, I don't know exactly how Jay Stratton picked the various people, but as we know, when he was director of the UAP task force, there were representatives from all branches of the military and every single part of the intelligence community. So that's sort of 18 parts, whatever it is these days, of the intelligence community, all the different branches of the military. So I don't know to what extent any of these people were pre-vetted for what their views were on UFOs, for what might be in their background in terms of PTSD or anything. I mean, of course, almost everyone in the military of a certain generation had cycled through multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and of course, many of them had seen and experienced dreadful things firsthand, up close and personal. So I don't know whether it was a question of choosing someone who would turn out to be a sort of fall guy for this, or just a question of each part of the intelligence community has to put someone up as a representative on the UAP task force, who obviously has to have the appropriate security clearances, the appropriate need to know, and has to be well placed enough to be the representative. So yeah, I'm not sure I agree that these people were pre-selected in that way. But obviously what you've now got is a whole bunch of whistleblowers coming forward. And clearly a lot of these whistleblowers, or some of them, were people who happened to be the representatives on the UAP task force from various different agencies. So they are who they say they are, and they did what they said they did.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking maybe from your perspective, if you were to choose, would you look for somebody with one of those backgrounds if you were trying to throw them off, somebody off the trail maybe eventually?
Oh, well, yeah, if I was solely trying to sort of set the whole thing up to fail, absolutely. But I don't think that was what Jay Stratton was doing. I think he just wanted the best people for the job. That's why I say I don't think that Grush was sort of pre-selected as a fall guy. I think that just with so many people on the UAP task force, you are going to get a mix. Some people probably thought it was complete waste of time and resources. Other people were probably glad to have that, and maybe were kind of closet UFO believers all along and thought their kind of X-Files dreams had come true. So who knows?
Well, I guess that takes us to, what are you thinking now where we're at in, with UFO or UAP disclosure? I mean, they had this latest congressional hearing. It seems to be the next biggest revelation was that they showed that Hellfire missile hitting that UAP. I mean, where are we at with all of it?
Well, I'm going to be honest with you and a little bit controversial. I am a little concerned that things have stalled. Or that they're in danger of stalling. We're certainly at a crossroads. And I don't know about you, but sometimes when I look at the social media feeds, I mean, I'm losing track of all the different whistleblowers. I'm losing track of all the different influencers and podcasters and is this person a sock puppet account for this particular whistleblower? And does is whistleblower X undertaking a sort of clandestine smear campaign against whistleblower Y, and even when you look in Congress, there are so many different people now with their finger in the pie here. We've got the Senate and the House, we've got the intelligence committees, we've got the armed services committees, we've got the oversight committees. Now we've got the newly formed task force on the declassification of federal secrets. We've got all sorts of things thrown into the mix. And yet, I think there's almost a little bit of fatigue kind of building up from even enthusiasts with this, saying, goodness, we're not far off 9 years or 8 or 9 years from the New York Times article exposing the existence of ATIP and the US Navy videos. And people are saying, well, come on, where's the beef?
Exactly. It seems like an endless episode of one of those, Bigfoot shows where every end of the episode they go, we're almost going to see Bigfoot. Just tune in next episode. Don't worry, he's coming. So it seems like we're being strung along. That's why, I'm glad I'm talking to you because, when you were at the Ministry of Defense, you must have come up with a plan okay, if we had to disclose, how would we do it? So what was the plan for the Ministry of Defense if they had to disclose this to the public? And what you're seeing right now, is that along the lines of what you had in mind when you were working there?
It was very difficult to formulate any kind of plan for this because there are so many variables. I mean, are you talking about disclosure or are you talking about first contact? And if we discover extraterrestrial life, for example, is it microbial life in the solar system? Is it picking up a signal from another civilization via radio telescopes? Is it finding some artifact? Or is it them finding us? And if it's them finding us, is it benign? Is it hostile? Is it neutral? Do we even know? And so in those circumstances, it's very difficult. All I can say is that the something of this magnitude would have to be announced by, in the UK, of course, the Prime Minister, in the US, the President, and it would literally be in the US here. It would be, President live from the Oval Office, my fellow Americans, people of the world, we're not alone, if it was going to be made public.
I know you guys came up with, a lot of different reasons of, what if scenarios. And, what were some of the scenarios with that they were saying, okay, this is why we could never tell anyone? Because from my perspective, the more you research this, the more it seems like this is tied into consciousness and, you may in real human evolution, So those are things that maybe, the government or any sort of a governing body wouldn't want people to know, that they were able to maybe have communication telepathically with these creatures, or that's how they communicate. And what were some of the reasons that the biggest reasons where they said, okay, this is why we can never ever tell people that this is actual real thing?
Well, let me give you a real world example that's more recent than my posting to the UFO desk, but I think it makes a valid point. We had contingency plans. Governments all around the world have contingency plans for a global pandemic. Yet, when COVID hit, which was, as I say, because we had contingency plans, it was hardly unexpected. We had global pandemics before, we'll have them again. Yet when COVID hit, kind of the world went pretty crazy. There was literally panic in the streets. We shut down the world. And yeah, obviously it was a very serious and deadly disease, but looking at it, it was very quickly pretty clear that if you were elderly with comorbidities, yes, you were at genuine risk, but if you were anybody else, you really weren't. And yet the world kind of collectively went mad. Well, if we went kind of crazy for something like that, where we had contingency plans, what would happen if we were suddenly and unexpectedly confronted with an extraterrestrial reality, in a situation where, in a universe 14 billion years old, there might be civilizations 1 billion years ahead of us? And you mentioned things like consciousness, telepathic communication. Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction writer and actually science communicator, once said very prophetically that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And yet that's what we'd be dealing with. So how can you prepare for that? And another absolute tinderbox, of course, was religion. You look around the world today and you see the conflicts and the hatreds that are caused and fueled by differences in religious belief. Well, you throw extraterrestrials into the mix, and who knows what their concept of God or religion might be. And like I say, it's like throwing gasoline on the fire.
Well, it's like you hear Anna Paula Luna talk about this, where she goes, well, on the religion side, if you read the Bible, things like the Book of Enoch, it actually kind of alludes to a lot of this. So it kind of maybe might even reinforce some of those things that they were talking about with the type of technology that they were describing, in those ancient times. So it does kind of open your mind up, but I'm curious, during your investigations, is that how people sometimes described it? Like if someone were to report an incident to you and say, oh, I think a demon is here, did you go, oh, let's go investigate this and see if maybe this is one of the UFO incidents that we can look at? Like, how did you separate the kind of the paranormal activity world when you were doing your investigations?
Yeah, that's a very timely question, not least because, and you mentioned Anna Paulina Luna, who of course is on the House Oversight Committee and chairs the task force on the declassification of federal secrets that is now going to be looking at UAP. But of course also, as you've seen literally, I think in the last day, the vice president gave an interview on a podcast where he talked about this issue, and he made that very point. And he said, and it's a very good point he made, he said that one person's angel or demon is maybe another person's UFO or alien. And this is a point that I've long made, and it ties in directly with your question. We can only, as humans, when we encounter something, high strangeness, shall we say, we can only interpret that and describe that through the lens of our cultural background, our belief system, and of course the language that we've got. So at the end of the day, all these words that we throw around, gods, devils, angels, demons, aliens, interdimensional entities, non-human intelligence, which is the latest buzz phrase, which David Grush, of course, all these are just labels. The actual phenomenon may go beyond our attempts to label it, and we may be dealing with something beyond our ability to even really conceptualize. I mean, we can only come at this from an anthropocentric viewpoint, and we religious people come at it from this angels and demons perspective. Maybe other people come at it from extraterrestrials or time travelers from the future, something from other dimensions. But again, these are just people's belief systems and labels and words.
So since you were, actually investigating this, for a government agency, and you've been able to see this evolve over time, because now we're just hearing secondhand what they're saying these might be, and now this term, you mentioned it, interdimensional, is being thrown around, and it seems like this came out of nowhere in the last couple of years. But you started investigating this, in the early 90s, right? So at that time, was that something that you were thinking of, or is this just a new kind of spin that they're putting? Because again, like when you look at some people that have been researching for many, many years, and they didn't mention this, and now you hear a government agency saying these might be interdimensional, it almost seems like very convenient. You've got all these science fiction movies mentioning multi dimensions, and then quantum physics, or they're mentioning multi-dimension too. And also, it seems like it might be another cop-out. So is that something that you were thinking back then? What were your views on what this possibly could be, back then?
Back when I was doing this in the 90s, we were a little more, shall we say, basic with this. We would get a report, we would treat it very much as a sort of solid physical object. So our investigative methodology was, well, let's get the radar tapes, let's look at that, see what it tells us. If we've got photos and videos, let's get them to the intelligence community imagery analysts. But again, your question is very timely, because of course back when I was doing that in the 90s, we didn't have the Large Hadron Collider. We didn't really have, and I forget the time scale of this, but we certainly didn't have the idea of string theory, for example, being as embedded as it now is in sort of theoretical physics. So we didn't have people like Michio Kaku literally doing experiments at the Large Hadron Collider, which, as I said, didn't exist at the time, and saying that for string theory to even work, for the equations to hang together, you need the existence of these so-called hidden dimensions. So things have changed and evolved in recent years. And again, back to your question, it's an important one, because how do you investigate this? And look, if somebody is very, very religious minded, they have an experience, and they frame it in terms of, demons or something, that kind of report probably isn't even going to get to the Pentagon's Arrow. it may get to the local Catholic church who'll send out an exorcist, and it will be the investigative tools, if you can call them those, will be sort of a crucifix and holy water. Whereas if you go down the other route of irrespective of what the reality is, but I'm talking about perception, if you report this, as one thing, it will be investigated as one thing. If you report it very much as nuts and bolts, I'm a pilot, I've had a sighting, that will go to Arrow. But if you report it as demonic or something, that'll go to your exorcist, your demonologist. So this whole question of labels and perception and culture and language is very, very important, because it kind of determines who does the investigation. And you couldn't think of, in one sense, two more different people to do an investigation than an exorcist with the Catholic Church on one hand, and I don't know, an intelligence community specialist in the Pentagon on another.
It's good that you mentioned that, Catholic Church, because that's one of the things that Dave Grush said, is that one of the earliest cases is that Mussolini, there was a crashed UFO in Italy, and Mussolini gave that to the Vatican, and they have evidence of that there, and they've got lots of historical data on the whole UFO non-human intelligence subject. So when you were there in the military of Ministry of Defense, did you reach out to like maybe the Vatican and try to do any investigations there? What was that even a thought back then?
Well, it was a thought, but we were very constrained by our terms of reference, which limited us to anything that took place in the UK air defense region. And although you could say, well, look, it's a global phenomenon, therefore reaching out to other people who might be able to bring something to the table is a good thing, there were extreme political sensitivities about this. Like I said right at the beginning of this interview, our policy was to play down the true extent of our interest and involvement in this with the British Parliament, with the media, with the public. If we'd have been caught, and I use that word deliberately, caught, talking to the Vatican about this, it would have caused extreme political embarrassment to SecDef, for example, if he was simultaneously standing up in the British Parliament and saying this is of no interest. So a lot of this, even if we did do it, a lot of it had to be back channel, kind of off the books stuff. I did meet, although I think this was shortly after my posting, but I did meet, for example, Monsignor Corrado Balducci, who was a Catholic cardinal who had spoken out about this issue and had made drawn parallels between UFOs and some of these religious phenomena. And he was aware, for example, of I suspect things in the Vatican archive that we maybe don't know about, but also, of course, things in some Renaissance artwork, which some people have interpreted as UAP. So he was a very interesting individual. And of course, the Catholic Church is doing some very serious thinking about this. And as far back as 2008, the director of the Vatican's observatory, Father Gabriel Jose Fuentes, gave an interview where he said there's no doctrinal objection to the existence of extraterrestrial life because it just makes the glory of God's creation even more expansive. And he said, in any case, man may place no creative limits upon God. It's not for human skeptics to say God wouldn't do that.
I want to ask you kind of some specific stuff about the things that you investigated, because you were there in the United Kingdom, and there seems to be some differences in what they see in the United Kingdom versus what they see in the United States and in other places of the world. Even if you look at the kind of the reports in Brazil, seem to be very different. Like, one of the things that sticks out is that crop circles seem to be a thing that happen in the United Kingdom, right?
Yes, again, I had to be very careful because it wasn't technically in our terms of reference. I did take a look at it because of the perceived links with UAP. But as I say, I had to tread carefully, literally and metaphorically. I actually visited some of the more interesting. I was one of the first people to step foot in the Julia set, a very interesting formation that appeared right next to Stonehenge, actually, in I think that was 95 or 96. But for the most part, I have to say I was skeptical about crop circles. I could see, I was aware of a number of groups of people, often like engineering students, design students, who would kind of take a break from their university studies and revision, sneak out and make these things almost just because they could. And some people who did it because they regarded it as conceptual art, where the reaction to the formations was as much a part of the art as the formation itself. And we've seen, because a number of commercial companies decided that when crop circles were a big thing, they would use them in adverts. We knew, because these companies would go and say to some of the people that made these things, go make us, we want to do a crop circle for our advertising campaign, or make our logo into a crop circle, and very sophisticated. So you knew intellectually, you knew it could be done. And if you could see people produce these, you'd see people produce these really sophisticated formations, logos, company logos, that sort of thing, then you knew, you knew that it could be done. So that's why I was a little bit skeptical on crop circles, but I did take a look.
But one of the things that you did point out is that there were a difference in even the beings that people were reporting seeing. Like here, we get a lot of reports of, let's say, the gray alien, the typical gray alien. But in the UK, you got reports of a different kind, right?
Yeah, sometimes you get these so-called Nordics, the tall blondes, but you get those here too. I think there's a couple of factors at play. Firstly, it goes back to the point I was making about you can only view this through the lens of your cultural background. And then when we look around the world, you mentioned South America, for example. South American culture is different from European culture. European culture is different, though there are maybe stronger linkages to North American culture. So that might be a factor, just that people are interpreting things in different ways. And it's almost like an observer effect. Maybe some of this only resolves into a pattern when it interacts with the observer, and therefore it takes something from that observer in terms of the.
That's interesting definitely interesting to think that it may just manifest itself differently to whoever's seeing this. But I mean, I've heard you give little stories about some of the more kind of compelling cases that were given to you that maybe weren't even necessarily that they were literal like aliens, but people thought people were acting so strange that they only could be alien. Like, tell me about that. I heard you say something about a gift shop.
Oh yeah,
a story of a gift shop that was reported in.
Yeah, the aliens in the art shop story, I call it. I think I first spoke to Chris Ramsey about this, and he asked me. He said, "Tell me a case that you haven't discussed before, or that you don't generally talk about." And I sort of thought for a moment, and I was like, "Oh my God, I haven't talked about that one for years," and then it kind of went viral, and yeah, it's this bizarre case where there was a very specialist high-end art shop in London, central London. A whole bunch of Nordic-looking people walked in, spent a long time there, and then kind of collectively came up to the counter to purchase one pencil, and then they presented like a £100 note, so big amount of money, and then walked away, and then the person in the shop was like, no, here's your change. And they all looked at each other puzzled, like they didn't even understand the concept of change. And the whole thing, this isn't a UFO story. maybe not even an alien story, but the person felt strangely enough about it to sort of call up a friend and say, aliens in the art store. And so I don't know. What do you make of something like that? Is it just a bunch of people playing an elaborate practical joke for no discernible reason? Is it, I don't know, maybe a group of special needs people from a school or something being sort of under supervision, maybe that wasn't seen, trying to interact in a way that they would have to if they're to live out in society as opposed to an institution? Or is it something, high strangeness, something other? I don't know. But those are the sorts of bizarre kind of cases that I've come across. And like I say, there's a surreality about the phenomenon or aspects of it when you look into it. But sometimes even UFO researchers will self-censor. And this is one of my kind of more sort of thought experiment points here, is that if the UFO community self-censors because they think, no, that case is too silly, I can't discuss that. And so you get these people who will self-censor, and they're like, I'm going to talk about the pilot sightings, I'm going to talk about the radar, but I'm not going to talk about the aliens in the art shop.
Well, I like, you had your book that came out a number of years ago, the Uninvited, I believe it was called, and one of the hypotheses that you came up with was that there's a lot of this talk of hybridization, right? Do you still believe that these things were trying to hybrid with us, and have you had an evolution of what you think their purpose is coming here?
Well, in The Uninvited, I tried to write that as an overview of not just the sort of alien abduction, alien contact phenomenon, but also going right back to the 50s and the 60s, the old contactees. And again, was this a different phenomenon, or was it the same phenomenon, but that it had evolved, or we had evolved, or both? Or is it, like I say, the cultural lens, and that cultural lens had changed as society has changed? Or is it a mix of all these factors? I don't know. I mean, obviously, if you talk to the UFO community, and back in the 80s, of course, people forget, but in the 80s and maybe well into the 90s, the whole alien abduction mystery was almost front and center. Through the work of people like Bud Hopkins, David Jacobs, and John Mack. And now it's almost kind of relegated back down to a much more niche subset of ufology. But at the time it was mainstream. And in The Uninvited, I just tried to throw all the different theories out there just to give people an overview. And I didn't necessarily try and push any particular narrative. I just said, look, these are the various theories doing the rounds. Take your pick, because I don't know. I didn't have an answer, even though I'd looked at this from inside the government. We, contrary to some of the conspiracy theories, we hadn't figured it out. We didn't know what it was.
So did you ever think of doing like a Where Are They Now on that? Because there were some great, investigations that you highlighted back then, and what was happening with the people. Did you ever think to do a follow up with them to see maybe a sequel to that book?
I haven't. That's a very interesting idea, and of course, I wrote that book. I think it was published in '97, so I wrote it '96, but it was obviously in some cases based on things that I had come across before that. So it's an interesting thought. We're 30 years on, and yeah, it would be interesting. One of the things that it would be particularly, I think, interesting to ask if I did do that is, was that it? Or have there been other things? Because one of the things that you hear from a lot of UFO witnesses and a lot of people who claim contact with NHI, or however you may want to describe it, is that this is very often a lifetime of experiences, starting in childhood. even, and certainly the whole abduction story, the idea of hybrids. Yeah, people say that's to do with specific bloodlines, blood types, whatever it might be. Yeah, interesting idea. I genuinely had not thought to do that, but perhaps, perhaps at least with maybe the half dozen or so cases that I specifically highlighted in the second half of the book, where I thought the first half I'll just give an overview and a history, but the second half I wanted to do a deep dive, and I think I did 5 or 6 chapters just on specific cases. And yeah, that would be interesting.
Yeah, that's immediately when I thought because I really loved that book and that your kind of an analysis on it. One of my favorite stories that obviously it's another one that you're famous for investigating is that Rendlesham Forest. So I'm curious. First off, can we summarize what that was and kind of what the findings were with this binary code?
Sure. My goodness. Okay. Short overview of Rendlesham. December 1980, 2 US Air Force bases in the United Kingdom as part of the wider American presence in NATO and Europe. Sightings over 3 consecutive nights. Witnesses included the deputy base commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt. Witnesses on the first night, Holt was the third night. The first night, John Burroughs and Jim Penniston, who actually encountered something that had landed. And that was interesting because, of course, the landing site could then be forensicated. They took out a Geiger counter. They found levels of radioactivity that seemed significantly higher than the average background. Again, all this is set out in the Ministry of Defense case file. Most of which I think has now been declassified and released. So again, people don't just have to take my word for it. The file is out there at the National Archives, and people can get it either in person if they visit, or I think electronically. So there's a nice sort of paper trail that people can follow, and it's a fascinating case. I mean, military witnesses, like you say, witnesses included the deputy base commander, who was initially very skeptical until he saw the thing himself. The binary code is a bizarre aspect of this. Jim Penniston from the first night said that he got close enough to touch the side of this thing and got a kind of jolt when he did so. And a few days later, he said almost as if he was under some sort of compulsion. He reached for his police notebook and wrote down 16 pages of ones and zeros, which he then thought nothing of and put away for 30 years. so if somebody wanted to do a spectacular fake, they wouldn't put something away for 30 years, and it only kind of got out by accident, and he was a bit reluctant. It's one thing to say you've seen a UFO. It's kind of okay because the deputy base commander had seen it as well. So you can talk about that. You can't talk about this weird stuff. And bear in mind, after the incident, he stayed in the service. And so he was very clear. He said, I would have lost my security clearance if I'd started talking about this kind of weird stuff. It was okay to say you'd seen the UFO because, like I mentioned, deputy base commander saw it too. So you've got your kind of top cover from the chain of command, but you can't go into the weird stuff.
And some of that weird stuff is, what the translations were. Like, what were some of the weirder things that stuck out to you, but the translations of some of that? Because when you look at it, there's an overlap to kind of some things that are going on right now when they look at some of these symbols that they're finding. What was the kind of weirder things that you saw?
Yeah, I'm doing this from memory, but I think in 2010, a TV production company got hold of this, and then they gave the raw data to a computer programmer called Nick Sisk, and he did a translation, which I think from memory was continuous exploration for planetary advance, eyes of your eyes, origin year, 8,100, which of course led Jim Penniston to then speculate that this might not be extraterrestrial at all, but could be time travelers from the future. And there then followed a series of coordinates that matched up with a number of ancient, sacred, spiritual sites on the planet, the Great Pyramids at Giza, the Nazca lines in Peru, Sedona, like here in Arizona, where and so I didn't know what to make of this. In one way, it seemed almost a little too obvious, almost like a sort of spiritual person's I don't know bucket list, but who knows? Maybe there's another message deeper in. Maybe that's just a sort of attention getter or something. I don't know, but it is what it is.
You're right. But when you were doing your investigations, did you hear of anybody else getting downloads?
Yeah, I heard of I mean, and of course this goes back to the 50s. Not necessarily a download of binary information, but shall we say telepathic messages, or feelings that people developed. And going back to the contactees of the 50s, you could say that messages, warnings about polluting the planet, warnings about use of nuclear weapons, and absolute prohibitions about taking them into space. These are messages that from the contactees and from the abductees go back to the 50s. You could say that as a sort of download. But again, does that, playing devil's advocate, is that a message from outside? Or are those our concerns, but just somehow projected onto something else?
Well, the reason why I asked about that, kind of the code that was on there, is because now we've got the Boogosphere, and I'm sure you've done a lot of research into that, and they're finding that there's messages on this. What is your take on the Boogosphere?
Actually, I'll be honest. Yeah. I haven't done a lot of in-depth research into that for two reasons. Firstly, is I just can't spread myself too thin and kind of be an expert on everything. So I have to. Some of these stories, like the Boogosphere, like the mummies and things, I just have to say no. I just don't have the time and resources to do that. And again, it's not just time. It is, as I say, resources, because you'd have to go there and you'd have to get the thing into a lab, and I don't know that I would necessarily get access, even with my background. And the other thing is, other people are on site already and doing work in that. So I do my thing, which is at the moment almost my role now is less that of an investigator, but more now as a communicator, as somebody who is fortunate enough to have a mainstream media platform, and therefore someone who will use this to take a lot of fairly complex data and to kind of translate it down to more accessible chunks, often in 3 or 4 minute mainstream news media interviews, which will reach millions of people.
Since you do have that reach, I'm glad you talked about that. Have you ever found yourself on the receiving end of sometimes that you might think are government officials or that were trying to use you to spread disinformation? Maybe pass on something that you kind of have to do the smell test to see if it flies. Like, have you felt that now? Maybe somebody that was in your position at the Ministry of Defense that's here in the U.S. going, okay, let's send this email over to Nick Pope. Hopefully he talks about it and throw some people off our trail. Have you felt that at all? Have you had any instances?
I'm not going to go into specifics because I don't want to disclose necessarily that I have suspicions about specific individuals, cases, or narratives. But I will say that on occasion, people have, how shall I put it, tried a little too hard to dangle something in front of me. And I don't like being played, even if it's by someone on my own side. It's like, if somebody comes to me and they are upfront about who they are and why they want me to do something, if I agree that it's legitimate, then I'm sure I would play my part. But I don't like being played. And yeah, on occasion I've seen, what looked like attempts to just push something, and isn't this interesting? And I'm not going to go into details of who and what, but yeah, it is something that maybe with my background I can spot when someone's just, and particularly when a very similar narrative comes from apparently independent sources, but pushing a very similarly worded narrative. That to me smacks of somebody somewhere in a basement office, has drawn up some talking points and wants them out there. And yeah, I'm not gonna be played like that.
You're not going to take the bait. So what is your perspective then on our foreign adversaries? And we are constantly told that we should be worried that this might be used as a weapon from Russia or China. How true is that? How far along do you think they are? We never. You would think we would see something from another country. We don't ever see much material from them in regards to this. How close do you think they are? Along the lines of this, using this technology, and is it something that we really should fear? Is it something that you guys looked into while you were, in the Ministry of Defense?
Well, we knew in the 90s that Russia had been looking at this. Russia, of course, had been looking at not just UFOs, but parapsychology, and particularly telekinesis and things, certainly back to the 50s and the 60s. And then you can get into another discussion about psychic spying, remote viewing programs and things the US in particular developed to counter. People talk about not wanting a missile gap. We didn't want a psychic gap either, but that's a whole different conversation. We knew that Russia, and we now know Russia and China obviously have their own UAP programs. We know that through intelligence sources. I don't know currently, because I'm now sitting outside that system, although I still talk to a few people, but essentially I'm for the most part outside. I don't have visibility of how far along Russia or China are, but unlike the United States, where under the legislation, AARO is mandated to report to Congress, and sure, you can have a classified report, but you've got to have an unclassified version of it. And these days, people can piece a lot together from open source intelligence, of course. But we have no idea really what the Russian or Chinese equivalent of AARO have been doing, or because they don't have a website, they don't publish data, they don't report publicly to the Politburo, say, in the way that the US has to publicly report to Congress. So it is a concern. It's a concern, yes, absolutely. Not least because we know this is a separate but overlapping subject. We know that some, not all, of course, but some UAP sightings here in the West are caused by adversary drones.
Right, and I like that you mentioned the the remote viewing thing, because one of my favorite kind of UFO stories is the Project Preserve Destiny, where the guy Dan Sherman, he said he was part of a military program to learn how to psychically communicate with aliens. Right, they told him you're going to learn how to talk with aliens. And to this day, he still believes he, was communicating with aliens, through some computer program that they were doing. But little did he know, during the same time he was at Fort Meade, on the other side of Fort Meade, the NSA was also doing extensive research into consciousness, ESP, and remote viewing. It was all happening there. So, my point is with this is that you never know if you're just being led astray to kind of, you're being manipulated in a way. So what do you think some people should look out for when we hear this information that's being released? You hear the Wall Street Journal article that said that this was all, just part of a hazing, disinformation, and then on the other hand, they're saying, oh, maybe Boeing did come out with some, or Lockheed came out with some technology that we should be looking at. So what would you say to everybody to kind of use your investigative training here to siphon out what is fact and what might just be some kind of ruse that's being played?
I would say trust but verify. And I would say, the principal investigative tools that everyone has are critical thinking and the ability to identify and use good sources. And that should be the case whatever you're talking about. But yeah, so it applies to UAP and wider research into things like remote viewing, consciousness studies. It applies to those things as much as it applies to any story you might read in the media. So trust but verify, use critical thinking, and identify and cite good sources.
I think easier said than done, but thanks for the advice. We will, I'll link out all your site and everything to this. Thank you so much for joining today. It's fantastic talking to you. You always give such great information. So I really appreciate this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.